Hey everyone, welcome back. If you are new here, my name is Lauren, and today I am going to be talking about all of the books that I read in the month of August. So I would say overall, August was an okay reading month. I read a grand total of just a little over 2,300 pages, and I read 1 4.5 star, 2 4 stars, 1 3.5 star, 1 3 star, 1 2.5 star, and I DNF'd 2 books. Now, because I did DNF a couple books this month, I just wanted to take a minute to talk about my feelings on DNFing books. This is how I feel about DNFing books for myself. You may feel differently, and that is it's completely fine. I do DNF books, like it does happen. I won't push through a book generally just for the sake of completion. In the last year before this month, I had only DNF'd 1 book. I was really dreading picking this book up. I didn't want to read it, so I DNF'd it. If I dread reading more of it, I will DNF it. There are too many books in this world to ever have to feel like you are dreading a book. Now, that being said, I am very, very neurotic almost about combing through my TBR and making sure that every book on there is a book that I am still interested in reading. If I ever stop wanting to read a book on my TBR, I take it off. If you go into a book sort of dreading it, not really wanting to read it, it's going to be an uphill battle for that book to kind of make it up to you. So that's kind of my, the broad gist of how I feel about DNFing. I do believe in DNFing. You should always DNF a book if you're not feeling it, but also be very mindful of what you put on your TBR and keep on your TBR. And if you start losing interest in them, take them off. All right, so I am going to get off my soapbox now and talk about the books that I've read this past month. The first book that I read in the month of August was 6 Wakes by Mur Lafferty. This is a sci-fi novel. It is a space opera with kind of a mystery element in it. It is about a crew that wakes up on their spaceship and they have been cloned. It's a clone story, really. Their original bodies are all dead and they have clearly been murdered and they don't know why. So this crew is trying to figure out what happened, how they were all killed, clearly there's a murderer in their midst, so they're trying to figure out who that is. I don't read a ton of mystery, but it was, it had a lot of intrigue in it. It wasn't like fast paced or anything, but because of that mystery element, it was very engaging. There's a lot of red herrings in this book, a lot of misdirection. So the mystery in this book, I think, was pretty enjoyable and pretty well executed. I gave this book 3.5 stars. 3.5 stars. That's pretty average for me for a book that I enjoy, but I get the sense that I'm not going to remember it a few months down the road. So yeah, still definitely, it's absolutely a worthwhile read, especially if you like mysteries and you have never read a space opera before. This would actually be a fantastic book for you to pick up. If you already like space operas and mysteries, you may enjoy this book. So yeah, I would definitely recommend it to anyone who likes those kinds of genres. The second book that I read in the month of August was River of Thieves by Clayton Snyder. This was also the first book of the month that I DNF'd, and I think I DNF'd it at about the 85% mark. The main reason that I ended up DNFing this book is because I don't think I ever fully understood what the overarching plot was. There are these little stories that are this kind of chain of stories where these thieves are setting up these con jobs. 85% that's a pretty good chunk of the book. But even at that point, I had no idea what was really ultimately happening. It's a fairly crass style of humor. A lot of people had issues with that. I didn't. I actually thought the book was really funny. I don't know, maybe I just have like a gutter mind or whatever, but I thought it was funny. I had a hard time envisioning who the characters, like physically who they were. I don't need an author to describe a character the way they look to a T, but I need something to build an image in my mind. They were just kind of this empty, hollow spot in my mind. This book, it felt a little bit like less a novel in its own right and more of a love letter to other fantasy writers. It made reference to all of these other books at some point or another. The Lies of Locke Lamora, The Name of the Wind, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Kings of the Wild, and Discworld. And it also made a ton of pop music references. I thought this was a pretty standard high fantasy novel, but then these pop music references would be thrown in, so I don't know when it was or where it was, so I couldn't picture this world, I couldn't picture the characters, and I had no idea where the story was going, so unfortunately, I ultimately DNF'd The River of Thieves. The third book that I read in the month of August was The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. This is a fantasy novel and it is set in China, kind of an ancient China setting. It is the story of a young girl named Ren who comes from she's very impoverished. She comes from a family that's really just kind of these shady people. She is just trying to escape this circumstance and trying to get into a military academy. There are a lot of politics at play during the story, war strategy, a lot of fighting and things like that. Something about this book, for about 75% of it, reminded me of Skyward by Brandon Sanderson, but fantasy and set in China rather than sci-fi set on another planet. But that last 25%, oh my gosh. If you've read this before, you know exactly what I'm talking about. There are some things that happen toward the end of this book that are harrowing. What made it even harder to digest is the fact that those events are based on actual events that really happened. I don't generally consider myself the most sensitive of readers, but this book really went to a dark place. I can understand why people love this book so much, though. The writing, it's very good writing. This is the first in a series. From what I understand, this series gets even darker. The end of this was hard for me to get through, so I'm gonna have to do some soul searching on that to decide if I want to continue in it. I gave this book 4 stars because it is very well written. If you haven't read this book and you like fantasy, especially if you like kind of wartime fantasy, strategy, political maneuvering, an ancient China setting, any of those things or any combination of those things, I would absolutely recommend it. But just be warned, approach it with care and look up some trigger warnings. So yeah, 4 stars for The Poppy War. The fourth book that I read this month was I'm Thinking of Ending Things by Ian Reid. If you have not read this book, it's been made into a Netflix show. This is a story about a young couple who are going to visit the boyfriend's parents. It's at night and it's snowing and it's kind of out in the middle of nowhere. It's a country farmhouse. Things are kind of strange that are happening in this book and you're meant to feel disoriented. If I go too deeply into the plot, it might spoil that experience for you if you want to read this book. But just suffice it to say that if you like books that are kind of disorienting in that way, you may really enjoy this book. Now, what I will say about this book, I ended up only giving this book 3 stars. And the reason is because of the ending, quite frankly. The experience of reading this book and, like I was saying, this disorientation and this intrigue, 5 stars. As this book is going, I was thinking to myself, like, in order to explain this, to wrap this up, this certain ending could happen, and I really hope it's not this thing. I'm really hoping it's not going to be wrapped up in this way. And it was wrapped up in that way. Most people will probably like the ending and like the way it's explained and wrapped up and all that good stuff, but it wasn't really for me. Still worth the read, though. From what I understand, this is a pretty well loved book, and if you haven't read it and you like any of those descriptors that I've given you for it, then I definitely recommend that you pick up I'm Thinking of Ending Things. The 5th book that I read this past month was The Constant Rabbit by Jasper Fforde. If you are someone who enjoys Discworld, Jasper Fforde may be an author for you. Specifically, my favorite book by Jasper Fforde, and maybe my favorite book ever, is Shades of Grey. If you enjoy Discworld and have not read this book, pick it up. It is very satirical and kind of off the cuff, but very, very smart. And he makes a lot of commentary on things ranging from politics to societal relations and economics. He makes a lot of humorous, but just on point references to those kinds of themes. So The Constant Rabbit. This is the story of a society where there was an event called they call it an inexplicable anthropomorphizing event. These animals, it was primarily rabbits, suddenly, inexplicably anthropomorphized into these kind of rabbit-human hybrids. This family of rabbits moves into this neighborhood. They are not really welcomed with open arms by any stretch of the imagination, which this book, I think, is talking a lot about racism and otherness. There's this just kind of huge conspiracy between the humans and these anthropomorphized rabbits. This book, it deals a lot with themes of racism and politics and bureaucracy, rationality and reality kind of getting mired down by bureaucracy in the world. You know, I didn't like this quite as much as I like Shades of Grey. I'm not gonna lie, it was a little awkward and uncomfortable for me. You know, that anthropomorphized relationships creep me out a little bit. Depending on how you feel about sort of anthropomorphized relationships might inform whether or not this book, the comfort level reading it, will be, you know, tolerable to you. However, what this book was trying to do as far as kind of this sort of social, political, bureaucratic commentary that it was making, it nailed these themes. Like, it absolutely nailed them and it talked about some pretty dark things, but in a very humorous, satirical way. I gave this book 4 stars. I don't think it was a perfect book, mostly because it creeped me out, and also the ending, it wrapped up a little bit too neatly for me, but it was really wonderful. If you like books that are heavily themed, but written kind of in a humorous, digestible way, then I hope that you will pick up a Jasper Fforde book. The 6th book that I read this month was The Renegades, or Renegades, by Marissa Meyer. This actually ended up being the other book that I DNF'd. I DNF'd it at about, I think it was about at 20%. It's more or less a superhero story. And the reason that I DNF'd this book, it had absolutely nothing to do with the characters or the writing style or the plot or anything like that, but simply the fact that it was a superhero story. Every time you turn around, there's another superhero movie coming out, and it's just, I'm really burnt out on superhero stuff. So I just ultimately realized that if I continued with this book, I was going to end up not liking it. And so, you know, I may come back to this book. I want to be able to give it a fair shake if and when I do read it again. And I feel like the only way I'm going to be able to do that is to read it when I'm not so burnt out. You know, it was what it was. It was a DNF for me. Yeah, that's kind of all there is to it. So yeah, DNF's Renegades. The 7th book that I read in August was Nightfall by Daniel Barnett. This is an independently published book. I think it's a horror. I would classify it as thriller-ish horror. It's definitely a horror novel. It's the first in a series called the Nightmareland Chronicles. So far, I think 5 books are out, and I think that the 6th is going to be released soon. It's a little novella. I think it's only like about 140 or 150 pages. You know, I was a little skeptical for myself because I'm not generally a novella person, but I wanted to give it a try, and I'm so glad that I did. When the book opens, the sun disappears, and the world is plunged into darkness, and the characters are kind of dealing with the fallout from that. It was disorienting. It was kind of dark. It was a little, had a ton of intrigue, some really strange action going on, and it felt very suspenseful. This book, I absolutely loved this book. I bought all 5 of the books that are out, and I think they're supposed to get here tonight. I'm super excited about it. Like I mentioned before, it is a horror. It is a horror novel. It's not so much like scary, like jump scare kind of scary. It's very unsettling. It's a very unsettling type of horror, kind of very like uneasy. The only qualm that I had with this book, I felt like the writing in places was a little bit clumsy. Specifically, some of the dialogue between characters could be kind of a little cliche. I originally thought I was going to knock it down to 4 stars because of it, but I can't stop thinking about it. I can't wait to continue in the series. I gave this book 4.5 stars. Because of this kind of weird dialogue going on in this book, I did knock it down 1/2 star. However, I could see, you know, in the next book or two, dialogue gets to be a little bit better, a little smoother, a little bit more natural. I could see giving the next book or two a 5 stars. So we'll have to see how that goes. But yeah, yeah, if you like horror at all, if you like novellas, if you like books that are unsettling and disorienting, I absolutely recommend that you pick up Nightfall by Daniel Barnett. The final book that I read in the month of August was The Anubis Gates by Tim Powers. This is a story about a man that has discovered how to time travel using these gates, the Anubis Gates. He takes this group through the gates to the 1800s. Before they can all leave, one of the members of this group is kidnapped and is unable to come back to present day. It's more or less about this particular character that is stuck in the 1800s mostly trying to survive, but also trying to find a way back to the time period he came from. I was really hoping that I was gonna love this book, but I didn't particularly care for it. I gave this book 2.5 stars. The scope of this book was just massive. The characters, there were so many characters. There had to have been at least 50 characters. And not to mention the fact that there was also like body switching in this book. Keeping all the characters straight and who they were was very difficult. I had a really hard time following it, therefore I began to lose interest in it. This book could have been a trilogy. It felt like 3 books at least squeezed down into one. And you know, I'm not a big series reader. I don't read trilogies a lot. I prefer standalones, but not like this. It was too much. It was way too much. The pacing was off. I'm a huge adventure action reader. I like that kind of stuff, but it was just dizzying. It was like the literary equivalent of the saying, too many cooks in the kitchen. It may be for you, but you might like that. If you like intense action with a ton of characters, a book that just never slows down, you may really enjoy this, but yeah, not quite for me. So 2.5 stars for The Anubis Gates. I wish I had liked it more than I did, but you know, it was what it was. So yeah, 2.5 stars for The Anubis Gates. All right, so I think that is going to be it for me today. Those are all of the books that I read in the month of August. I'd be really curious to know if you've read any of these books and what you thought about them, or if you have read any great books this past month, please tell me about them in the comments down below, because I am always looking for my next great book recommendation. I would also be curious to know your thoughts on DNFing books. Do you DNF books? How often do you DNF books? And how do you feel about that in general? So please talk to me about that in the comments down below as well. If you did enjoy this video, I hope that you will like it and possibly subscribe, and I will see you